So welcome to Collect Emulator Void. We're still in Generation 5 and this is going to be a video on the Nintendo 64. Yes, the one you've all been waiting for. So what can you say about the N64 hardware? Well, the main thing that you've noticed for it first, that it is built solid. I mean, these things are built as solid as a rock. Internally, there is actually only one hardware set, albeit with one or two revisions depending on what territory you live in. Now, externally, there are so many variations of this console. This is where, with colour variants and things like that, where Nintendo started to lose their minds, quite frankly. Depending on where you look, there are up to 30 different colour variations of this console, and that may even vary from territory to territory, because there are some not one of a kind, but maybe, you know, 100 of a kind variants as well, which are quite rare. The other thing you'll notice about this console, if you weren't there at the time and you've never seen one before, is that it is cartridge only. So what does that mean generally for the story of the N64? Well, it means there aren't really any third-party developers. Now, before you start yelling at the screen and saying that, oh, but there's Rare and there's HAL Laboratory, no, they are not third-party developers, they are second-party developers. Why are they counted as second-party developers? Well, because although they're outsourced, they are actually partly owned by Nintendo, so that effectively makes them second party developers. So they are, yes, they are technically third party, but they didn't really make anything for anyone else, because Nintendo basically said, we own you, or we own most of you, so you'll make games for us. That's how that worked. So there is a story basically behind the reasons that Nintendo decided to stay cartridge only. Now, it's been touted that part of the reason was anti-piracy. Well, I can sort of understand that, but it didn't really seem to affect anyone else. So I think that is a bit of a bullshit reason. The other thing that people always tout is, well, they got so burned on working with, trying to work with Sony first of all, and then trying to work with Philips later on, that they decided that we just don't like CDs anymore. And again, that smacks to me as a bit of a bullshit story, because the reason why, basically the reason why they pulled out of the Sony deal was because they realised they weren't going to get royalties from game sales, because that was all tied up in legalese from Sony's point of view, so they pulled out of that deal. And then the deal with Philips basically was just to fuck over Sony. There was no other reason for that deal. So, I mean, the deal with Philips, Nintendo basically had the upper hand on that entire deal, and we're going to go ahead with it anyway until they decided they just didn't want to. I think the reason they've gone cartridge only, and call me cynical, it was because you got to bear in mind, up to this point, Nintendo had almost an absolute grasp on their first party developers, and it was a very costly business being a Nintendo third party developer. Yeah, sure, you made some money, but Nintendo always made the lion's share, because you had to go to Nintendo to get them to produce all the cartridges. Now, yes, if you wanted to produce CD games for a CD-based Nintendo console, yeah, you would still have to pay a license fee to Nintendo, but you wouldn't necessarily have to pay Nintendo to make the CDs for you. You could get anyone to do it, really, and provided you paid the license fee, that was fine. So I think part of the reason, or the main reason they continued to stick with cartridges, was because they wanted to get this hold, they wanted to keep this massive profit margin for themselves. And in this case, because suddenly all the third-party developers realised that Nintendo aren't the only game in town anymore, and hadn't been for a while, they decided, do you know what, it's not worth working with you anymore, we're off, bye. And basically I think to be honest, the only third-party developers that didn't bugger off was ones that didn't really care whether the games were any good or not. So anyway, that's the story on cartridge only, and that is the first thing you'll notice about the console. Obviously, the main drawback with being cartridge only is you can fit far less on a game, and this is another thing that led to the jumping ship of all the third-party developers, most notably Square at the time, because they were developing high polygon count Final Fantasies and things like that would soon turn into Final Fantasy VII. But if you've seen the tech demo with the Final Fantasy VI characters, I mean, you look at it and even that, you sort of go, would that work on a Nintendo 64? I don't know. So there's no RGB support natively. Now, I am given to understand that if you have certain early models, the first revision of the board, this can be modded in. But it's not a very easy process to do, and yeah, and you wouldn't know which variant of the board you had until you opened it up and had a look anyway, and even then you'd have to know what you were doing. Basically, assume that any Nintendo 64 you buy cannot be modded. And then if it turns out later that it can, then you're fine. So supposedly some of the early models can be RGB modded, and that will always invariably be the grey one. That won't be any of the colour variants that came later, because they were on later revision boards with a slightly modified graphics chip. That it apparently can't be done. Now, this is all third-party information, by the way. I don't know this for certain. I've never tried to RGB mod a N64, so I'll probably ask your local modder for more advice on this. So that's pretty much it for the console hardware. There's nothing else to really talk about. So let's move on to the accessories. Now, the N64 controller is a very good controller when I mean, a lot of people really don't like it. There's nobody that kind of likes it. You either love it or you hate it. It's just one of them controllers. I like it because I know that it was actually designed for a single purpose. And that purpose is Mario 64. There's no getting away from that. It doesn't matter which way you try and slice the design of that controller. It is custom designed to play Mario 64, and that's it. And invariably that is the thing that it's best at. Now, luckily, Mario 64 is a very, very good game. But I think there obviously are going to be problems over time and hindsight with controller designs like this, where they effectively had the mechanics of the game in place and then designed the controller around it. That really shouldn't be how it works. You design your controller and then you decide what games can be played using it. You don't usually do it the other way around, but it's very obvious that this is what Nintendo did when they were designing the controller. The only problem with it is that over time the central analog stick will wear out and become a bit twitchy with excessive use, and that unfortunately is something that again is very difficult to fix, because I don't know if there's anywhere that does. I did talk about this in a video not long ago, but I don't know if there is anywhere that does third-party sticks that you could just, you know, you could take, maybe open the controller, take the old one out and put a new one in and it's fine. I don't know if that is even a thing, but as far as I know it's not. So that's pretty much it really, is the controllers. That's the thing that everyone remembers. Now, the controller had a slot in the bottom where you could plug in other stuff. There's a rumble pack, and I think Nintendo were the first ones to do this. I'm pretty sure they did it before Sony thought of it. In fact, Sony may well have copied that, and that's probably what led to the invention of the DualShock controller with the sticks and the rumble feature, was the Nintendo the N64 pad with its rumble pack. You can also put a memory card in there, which isn't used by a lot of games but is required for some, so that's a handy thing to have. and that's obviously just for game saves. And the reason why it began to be used more often with some of the later games is because it comes down to this space issue on a cartridge. It's like, well, save games they don't take up much room, but they take up some. And basically, if you can offload anything, you can offload to an external source on a cartridge is a good idea. So that's why the memory cards came about. The other thing is something that I've got, and it's called the Pokemon Transfer Pack, and this basically is a device. It slots in the bottom of the controller, and if you have a Pokemon game on the N64 and you have a copy of Pokemon, I think it works with red, blue and yellow on the original Game Boy, you can transfer your stats and some of your Pokemon to the game that you're playing on the Nintendo 64. Now, I've never owned a Pokemon game for the 64, and I have never owned any of the original games on the Game Boy that the transfer pack works for. But I have actually got one, and I have no clue, I have no recollection of where I got it from, how much I paid for it, etc, etc. I think at some point it's arrived in a box with other stuff and it's sort of been thrown in the corner. I have theories on how I may have acquired it, but nothing that I can actually go, oh yes, I definitely got it there. So I've actually got one of these despite not having any compatible games for it. Now, one of the accessories, and in fact pretty much the only accessory that you definitely will want to get if you've got a Nintendo 64 is the memory expansion. And what this goes in the front of the console. There's a little flap that you can put off, and you can take out the memory that's in there and basically double the memory. Now, these were bundled with, I think it was Donkey Kong, these came with, but you could buy them separately, and these are probably the most difficult accessory to come by, because they're actually required for 3 games, I think, but the games they're required for are actually good ones. So everyone wants one of these, and they go for far more money than they're probably worth. So if you don't already have a Nintendo 64 and you're thinking of buying one, try and buy one with the memory expansion intact. So on to the games. This might be a bad point, good point, bad point type situation, like a sort of shit sandwich but in reverse. Because the 2 lots of shits are going to be on the outside and then lovely ham in the middle, perhaps. I don't know. So most of the collection of games on the Nintendo 64, and you can check this is fact, most of the collection are just grey plastic spacers on your shelf. That is what they're going to be. It's an seemingly, and this is going to apply to probably at least 75 if not 80% of the games available for the console. They are either racing games, rubbish sports games, first-person shooters. There's one RPG, which is called Holy Magic Century. At least that's what it's called here. I think it's called Quest 64 everywhere else. But that's the only one I can think of that's an RPG, and it's really boring and not very good. There is, as you well know, the game with the fox in his space plane, but now I might split the room with this comment, but I think when it came to pushing the limits of a system and innovation, I think the first Starwing did it better than Lilac Wars did on the N64. And for those of you that aren't in the UK or Europe, then Starwing is Star Fox and Lilac Wars is Star Fox 64, just to keep the sort of translation going worldwide. I just think that Fox is driving around in his space plane feeling really sad and really nostalgic for the days where he was pushing the hardware that he was planted on. I just don't find it as innovative as the first game. I'm sorry, and I don't. And I find the voices really, really irritating. Just constantly irritating. I don't like the Star Fox on the N64. There you go. You can have that. But hey, that's just my personal opinion. I'm not over keen on the one on the Nintendo, on the Super Nintendo, but then it did pretty much absolutely all right with the help of special chips, but it did really push the hardware it was sitting on. There's no mistake. Even if you just look at it from the point of view of a tech demo of what the FX chip could do, then it's still okay. Yeah, and I think the trouble is once you've got to that point, to then with the sequel on the next generation console, not just a 16-bit console, but a 64-bit console, so 4 times as good. It's just disappointing. I'm sorry, but it is. So that's the bad stuff. That's the bad games. Again, this is another console where you're just going to have to do your research. There's no. Everyone's going to like different games, and the stuff you're going to enjoy might be different from the stuff anyone else will enjoy. But we all know, even with that sort of grey area of what one person likes, another might not, you know what's a bad game and what isn't, generally. So what is good on the console? Well, all the Mario games, that's the Mario Party stuff, obviously Mario 64, you definitely need to get that. The Pokemon games, Banjo, Conker, if you can afford it, and GoldenEye. Now, this GoldenEye, if you take Mario 64 and Mario Kart, and maybe Smash out of the equation, GoldenEye is the N64's killer app, especially if you have friends, because you get 4 people sat in front of GoldenEye, you won't just lose an afternoon, you'll lose a week. The multiplayer, it's obviously very, very dated by today's standard, but for the time, it was just phenomenal. There was nothing like it. 4-player on one screen, GoldenEye is absolutely brilliant. If you ever have an N64 with GoldenEye and 4 controllers, honestly, invite your mates round. They will love it. The only rules is you can't be odd job. You're never, ever, ever allowed to be odd job, because that's cheating. What else can we say about the games? Generally, the draw distance is pretty piss poor on most of the games, and this does apply to the first and second party games a little bit, but most of the third party stuff you will definitely notice the draw distance. Like, it's the same sort of problem as what was on the Atari Jaguar, if you've seen that video, but at least the N64, when they've designed the games, they've obviously tried to compensate this through anything that uses backgrounds. Unfortunately, if you're playing something like maybe Turok or something like that, one of the early release games, they haven't really done it that well, and it is just like a walk through the fog. So that is a problem. What else if you're actually collecting the games? Flimsy boxes is an issue. The N64 has some of the flimsiest boxes in the world. Trying to find a boxed copy in very good condition it's insane. The only time you're probably going to find one now is if you buy off another collector, and bearing in mind that another collector knows what things are worth, so unless you're buying 20 games off them, you're probably not going to get that much of a deal. Unless they're a collector that's just given up on collecting and wants rid of the stuff. That's always a possibility. Again, if you see these things boot sales and in charity shops and things, you're not going to see them in charity shops anymore. They've pretty much all gone. Although, you never know. quite often stuff like if you buy a Pokemon game, the transfer pack won't be there. If you buy a Donkey Kong game, then definitely the memory expansion won't be there, especially if it's just the game and there's no console, because the person that donated the stuff probably left the transfer pack in the console and the person in the charity shop didn't have a clue what was going on, because they generally don't. So, you know, if you do find a boxed copy of Donkey Kong somewhere, expect that it will not come with the memory expansion, because it never does. So the other thing about the games is, again, there was no real effort to sort of push the hardware that it was on. Now, we know from, you know, being in the future, exactly what the Nintendo 64 hardware is capable of if you push it. People have actually done this. The trouble was, there was a bit of an issue in development where the development machines that certainly that Rare were working on to produce their stuff like GoldenEye and things like that, they were set up to such a specification where they were programming the games, reduced textures and such like. It's a bit complicated, but I'll try and explain. They were set up to a certain specification that it was envisaged that the Nintendo 64 hardware would be. By the time the Nintendo 64 actually came out, that specification had been revised up somewhat. And so what it means is that all the early release games, not a single one of them tried to push the hardware. So that is why quite a lot of them do contain that fog, is because when they were programmed up, the graphics chip that was supposed to be in the Nintendo 64, if you're following me with this, the specifications for it were actually less than what ended up being in there. So they didn't want to push. They didn't push the hardware that eventually ended up on the console. They pushed the hardware from a point of view of it being less powerful than it actually turned out to be. So this is basically the reason why you get a lot of fog on early release Nintendo 64 titles. But it doesn't detract from the fact that the fog is really irritating, is what I'm trying to say. I'm losing my voice here. So let's take the first party stuff and the second party stuff out of the equation. So yeah, you've got the stuff made by Nintendo themselves, you've got the stuff made by HAL, you've got the stuff made by Rare, and by the way, any one of the Rare titles is a brilliant game. So if you are collecting for this, you have to have all of them. I think it's about 8 at the last count, but they're all good. So what's left of the third party titles that you actually should be playing? And I could only think of 3. This may be different I think there was more games in the US and Japan. Obviously there was more in Japan, because there always is. But I think there was more games in the US than there was here. But my pick from the UK set is Mischief Makers, which is a good game. No, I haven't played this on an actual N64, but I've played it through an emulator, and it is a brilliant game, and it looks really good. Wetrix, which I think was originally a Nintendo 64 exclusive, and it's sort of a really silly game where it rains, and you have and the lay of the land changes, and you have to make not rivers, you have to make lakes and things like that. It sounds, when you look at it, it will look really complicated. Once you start playing it, it's really, really addictive. So that is a good game. And Star Wars Shadow of the Empire is a really good game as well. Now, Pod Racer's okay, but again, you're talking about a system that basically has 350 odd games, of which about 100 maybe are racing games. So Pod Racer's okay as racing games go, but if you are an N64 collector, how many racing games do you need? So I haven't included that. Shadows of the Empire. If you're going to buy one Star Wars game, Shadows of the Empire. because there's loads of different stuff to do. The other Star Wars, I think the other Star Wars one that I know of is Rebel Assault or Assault Leader or something like that, and that's just all in a ship. In Shadows of the Empire, you get to walk around. You're not like Han Solo. You're some other guy. I can't remember his name. But it's not anyone you've heard of from the movies, but you're just wandering around. It's sort of like Star Wars GoldenEye, but with ships as well. It's pretty good. I think that probably wraps it up for the stuff for the N64, but there was actually another add-on that I just want to talk about at the end of the video now, and that is the Double D disc drive. Now this is a Japanese only addition to the console, although recently US prototype models have started to surface, and there's a guy on YouTube called Metal Jesus, and he owns one of them, which I've seen recently. And so if you want to find out about the US variant of this, then you can go and look at his video, but because I didn't know there was a US version up until I saw his video on it. So, but apparently these things have started to surface. But effectively, it's a Japanese only add-on, and it was basically, the idea behind it was Nintendo began to realise they were losing so many third-party developers onto other systems, basically because of their insistence on using cartridges. Now, I've already talked about why I think that is, but the main reason why it was a stumbling block for developers is because CDs just gave you so much more space. I mean, could you imagine if something like Final Fantasy VII had come out for or something even bigger, Final Fantasy IX? I mean, that's on 4 discs. Could you imagine if that had come out for the Nintendo 64? You're talking something like 50 cartridges, and how much would that even cost you? It's just ridiculous. Maybe 50 is excessive, but it's a lot of cartridges. Let's face it. It was just a no-go. So Nintendo tried to address this a little bit with the and there were similar sort of cartridges, but sort of floppy discs. What they're called is magneto-optical discs, and it's basically like a high-capacity floppy disk. I can't think of any other way to try and explain as to how it actually works, because I'm not entirely sure how it works, to be honest. But it's like a large capacity floppy disk, and so this basically allowed you to put bigger games on. What they basically did, though, is that no third-party developers weren't interested in this thing by this point. They realised just how much profit they were making by putting stuff on other systems, most notably the PlayStation. And they just it came to market too late. Nobody was interested. The only people that put stuff on it was Nintendo themselves, and there was a load of creative style stuff like creative photo studios and things like that. The sort of stuff that was built on the concept of Mario Paint and took it a little bit further. There was Doshin the Giant is the one that everyone mentions when they talk about this system, because it was a system exclusive. As far as I know, I mean, there's obviously ports of it been done later on, but I think at the time that was probably the only place you could play it for about 5 or 6 years. So that's the one people always mention. And there was an expansion pack to F-Zero that was released on this thing, but that was about it. And to be honest, although I'm mentioning it, it's not really, especially in places that aren't Japan, it's not really part of the Nintendo 64 story. For my money, it's far too much money to even bother getting. It's a lot of money to buy. You would also have to buy a Japanese console in order for it to work. There's very few games available for it, and most of the stuff that is available for it, you need other stuff in order to get it to work, like the Creative Studio. You need like I think it works with the Game Boy camera and things like that. It's just it's not worth it. again, it's something, it's a collectible to put on your shelf. It's not anything that you would actually use, most likely. Nintendo 64. No, I myself have a bit of a checkered history with this console. There's at least one story about it that makes one of my friends look like an idiot, and there's at least another two stories that make me look like an absolute fucking moron to do with this console. So the first story is that a friend of mine got one of these, and their birthday was the 30th of April, 1997. Bearing in mind, at that point, the Nintendo 64 was new on the market. I think it had only been out since just before Christmas, and that was what they got for their birthday. And the price of a Nintendo 64 then was £230 something, or thereabouts, somewhere between £200 and £250. They hadn't yet dropped the price. So it gets a console on the 30th of April 1997. On the 5th of May 1997, Nintendo announced that day they were reducing the price of the Nintendo 64 console to £99.99. This was obviously a really, really funny thing, although my friend's parents didn't find it very funny at the time, because obviously literally a fortnight before they'd forked out 230 quid for this console. So that was one really story that happened at this time. So that was, at least the N64 gave me a chuckle. Now, a few years later, probably in 99, 2000, there was a guy that used to do the market stalls where I live. Originally he had a shop here, and he decided that the rent for the shop was too much, and all his money was tied up in stock. And why was he renting a shop when he could just drive it around to different towns in a van and basically sell it on market stalls? Which is exactly what he did. Anyway, at the time, I was buying, I think maybe PlayStation 1 or PlayStation 2 games off him. They're probably PlayStation 2 games, so this might have been 2001. This might be slightly later than I think it is. Because I had it in my head it was about 2000, but it might be 2001. So anyway, but I went down there one day, right through the stuff, and he literally had a stack, must have been half a dozen, of the Pikachu Nintendo 64s. You remember the one where the reset button was Pikachu's foot, the blue one? It's like an elongated version. And I think he wanted like a tenner each for them. And stupid me just went, oh, no, I've got no interest in that. He actually had a boxed one that he wanted about 20 quid for. And I just, no, I'm not interested in N64. I'm going to buy loads of PS2 games. They're brilliant. So, and then, well, I went there next week. They'd gone. So, went there the following Thursday, and somebody had obviously snapped them up. Obviously somebody was slightly more foresight than me. So yeah, that makes me look an utter dick, but whether it does or whether it doesn't is kind of irrelevant, because it's what happened. So yeah, and the third story I want to say about this must have only been about 2 years ago. I went down, there's a charity shop near me. I'm not going to mention them because I don't want to make them sound like a dickhead. But near the counter, they put, when they've got what they think are high value electronics, they put them in this sort of glass case. It's like a giant glass case with like a big revolving set of tea trays in the middle, like made of glass as well. And they have stuff there. It's like a sort of showcase thing you might see on The Price is Right. But I have one of them in there, and it's like 2 years ago, and I went down, and there was a Nintendo 64 with one controller and all the hookup cables, and there was just loads of games in there, and they had stuff like, they had Mario Kart in there, there was whichever the Zelda Gold cartridge is. I think it's Ocarina of Time. He had one of them in there, and it was all in really good nick. None of it had a box, but it was all there. And I said to the guy, "Oh, how much are you ask?" Because nothing had a price on it, and he sort of went, "Well, the console itself is £22 or whatever," and I said, "Well, how much do you want for the Zelda?" And he was like, whatever it was, £26, let's say. It was something around that mark. And then laid out the prices for the other games. And I basically had an argument with him in the shop. I said, "No, that's too much. You're charging too much. They're not worth that." And he said to me, "Well, that's what they're going for on eBay." And not having looked into N64 stuff for a long while, I got my phone out and I did check, and that was almost exactly what the prices were trending at on eBay at the time. I think they'd only just brought in that trend feature then, because that's only a couple of years old. So I did have a look, and yeah, fair enough. And I basically had this argument with the guy in the shop. It's like, well, I was sort of harumphing and hurrahing about it, and sort of saying, well, I've come to your charity shop and, you got it donated for free. Why should I be expected to pay eBay prices? And I still do really have that sort of attitude in charity shops now, to be fair. But had I known what the games would actually be going for in just 2 years' time, then I may well have bought them. But thanks to my righteous indignation, I didn't, and left the shop. And I don't think I've actually bought anything from them again, because they are a bit overpriced. They are one of these charity shops that eBays everything, the fly little bastards. So you never get a deal in there. Anyway, so that's my hilarious history with the Nintendo 64, and I still don't actually own one. My sister had one for a long time, and I asked her about it, and she doesn't know what happened to it. She had it for a while, and then nothing, and then she doesn't know where it is. So I thought I may even be able to coax a freebie out of her, but she has no clue what happened to it. It may be in a loft somewhere where she used to live. That's the best we can narrow it down to. So I don't own one. No. Normally, I end this video with, a verdict: avoid, emulate, or collect. No, don't avoid, because you'll be missing out if you do. Emulate. This is going to be another one alongside the Sega Saturn, but not as bad a scenario. No. The N64 for a long time was reasonably difficult to emulate. Now, we're getting there now on PCs and things like that. But the main machine I use for emulating, certainly if I'm capturing stuff that I'm going to use as footage, I use a Raspberry Pi console. Now, even though it's almost to the point where it's emulating most things, it still has trouble with the N64. Now, there are three main emulators on there, and it has trouble with all of them. Mario Kart seems to be a particular problem, and something like Conker is a problem because it's overly intensive. Mario Kart seems to be a problem with the Raspberry Pi because it's just never quite right. Bits of the screen are missing and things like that. So we're only just now getting to the point where you can emulate an N64 properly using a full PC. So obviously for people that emulate systems on newer systems, that's not really you can't really do it. Although, like I say, we're getting there on PC, and it's almost, give or take, 100%. You might still have trouble if you're playing something intensive like Conker or like Smash Brothers or something like that. You might still have issues trying to emulate it. So you can't. If you can emulate it, then do. Now, collecting is an issue, and it's mainly an issue because of the price of the games. Now, if you want boxed copies, boxed complete copies, you are going to spend far more than what it's worth. The only advice I would give to somebody that wants to collect Nintendo 64 is do not go for a full set. Whatever you do, you are out of your mind if you're going for a full set. If you're looking for a full set, boxed, complete, you should be committed, because you are going to spend so much money, and honestly, to actually play the vast majority of the games, it's not worth it. It really isn't worth it. You've wasted your money and your time looking for these things. And if you're paying retail for them, no. The only advice I could give to people, really, that if they wanted to collect for the N64, and you should really, because it's not really like any other console. It's not like any other Nintendo console. It's not like any other console that came before or came later. It's sort of in its own little niche. Now, I would go, if I was to collect, I would go cartridge only, and I would really, really, really curate that collection properly. Like, I would literally only buy stuff that I enjoyed playing. So that would basically put my N64 collection at about 50 games maximum. That would be where it should be, and I think 50 games that are all stuff that you want to pick up and play. And I have said this before in other videos, and I will say it again because it definitely applies in this situation. If you have 50 Nintendo 60 or 40 to 50 Nintendo 64 games that any one of them you can pick up and play and have an enjoyable time, then you have got a good collection. Don't let anyone tell you that you need to have a full set, because for stuff that was released on this console, you definitely don't need a full set. Most of the cartridges that came out for this, they would be far more useful as being melted down and used as something else, to be perfectly honest, or having the tin plating extracted from them to make something useful. Even if you do want to buy cartridge only, there are still the expensive ones out there, and the two that are always, and this has been true, this has probably been true for the last 4 or 5 years, the two that are always going to set you back the most money are Conker and StarCraft. So if you like them, they are going to cost you a fortune, which is a shame, because Conker is a brilliant game. It really, really is. So you're probably talking about maybe 100 to 200, depending on the condition of either one of them. And in fact, I think StarCraft has actually gone above Conker now, because it's, for some reason, it's more sought after, although I can't understand that personally. So bearing in mind, like I say, if you want to collect for this system, then be wise about it. Go for the 40 or 50 that you would actually want to play, and get Conker and StarCraft. If that's ones you want, then get them out of the way first before they go up anymore, because it seems, especially Conker, and seems to be jumping up and down on a weekly basis. You never quite know what price it's going for. So yeah, that's about it. And there are a lot of problems with this console and the games, obviously, but if you can look past some of the problems, and you can have a well curated game collection, I think you will have a very enjoyable time collecting for this console. And bearing in mind that even though some of the games are expensive, relatively expensive, most of them are also quite abundant. So you know, say you were bidding on eBay for something and you narrowly miss out because somebody pips in at a fiver more than you put, there'll be another one tomorrow and the next day and the next day. These things are always being sold and, you know, presumably sold and then resold. I don't know, but there's never going to come a point where these games aren't about, because they were made in reasonably high numbers and not many people owned the consoles at the time. But as for the sort of, if you're the sort of box collector that collects colour variants, I think it's probably fair warning that these things are probably at the absolute apex of their prices right now. So if you want to collect colour variants and things like that, and for the controllers as well, if you want to collect boxed colour variants, and you're looking at maybe selling them on at some point in the future, bearing in mind that I think that sort of thing has probably reached its absolute apex and they are only going to go down. So if that is something you want and it's something you're looking at keeping for a very, very long time, then hang on and maybe get it later, is the only other thing I'd say, because as we know, colour variants of things don't really hold their value. The Pokemon ones might. If you've got a boxed Pokemon Stadium version or a Pikachu version, then they might just hang on to their value for a little while, because Pokemon's not going anywhere, it's staying. So do bear that in mind. But as far as the games are concerned, I think you can do worse than having a well curated collection for this console. So I think that's it for my video on the Nintendo 64. The next and last video of Generation 5 is going to be on the Sony PlayStation. Obviously, you know, as we know from future hindsight, the king of Generation 5, there's no question, just going by the amount of sales. But is it necessarily the best thing to collect? Well, find out in the next video, I suppose. And again, if you have any comments or questions or something I may have missed out, interestingly enough, as I'm recording this today, and the video I did on the Amiga 1200, the CD32 one, has literally blown up with comments today from one guy that did actually call me on some things, quite rightly so, because there was stuff I had missed out, omitted, got wrong, and as I've always said, I have no problem with that whatsoever. And I'll say it again here: if you think there's something I've got wrong or missed out or omitted for some reason, bearing in mind that not everything I miss out is missed out by mistake. Some things are things that I could have mentioned, but I haven't put them in because I thought they were largely irrelevant to most collectors. So sometimes when I miss something out, it's not necessarily something that I've got wrong. It's something that just I didn't think was worth mentioning. But if you do think there's anything there, then do put it in the comments. And if I think, yeah, maybe you're right, I haven't done something correctly, then I won't re-edit the video and sort of shoehorn it in the middle. But what I will do is I will try and direct people to read the comments, because I'd hate for anyone to be going away with just absolute misinformation. But then this is sort of entry-level stuff. I mean, if you already know an awful lot about the N64, then this probably isn't really aimed at you anyway, because likelihood is you are a collector with a couple of 100 games and maybe 100 or 50 away from completing a full set. So if you are that sort of person, then obviously this isn't really aimed at you. This is aimed at the people that want, that don't really know anything about it and want to, as like a starting block to get involved, just to maybe one day collect him for the system. I don't know. So anyway, the long and the short is I'm rambling here now, and I'm very well aware that my time is coming up to, what, 51 minutes. That's obviously before I've edited out all the silly stuff. So yeah, if you have any comments to make, then do put them in the comments, or Twitterize me. There's the Twitter thing there, so you can find that on Twitter. And that's about it, and hopefully I will see you in the Sony PlayStation video, which is going to be recorded straight after this one, so hopefully it will go up either the same day or a day later. So you shouldn't have to wait too long, and I will see you then.